Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Demai Perek Beis Halacha Hey, and God willing, we'll make a siyum on Perek Sheni, and we'll start today Perek Shlishi Halacha Aleph. We are going to be learning Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, 6 lines from the top of the Amud by the new Halacha by the Mishnah. What we have learned until now is that when Demai is sold in large quantities, so then the Demai tithings has to be made dafka by the buyer. When Demai is being sold in small quantities, which is normally the case when it's being sold in a shop by a chenvani, by a shopkeeper, then it has to be tithed by the seller. And the Mishnah is going to begin, and we already quoted this Mishnah yesterday, quoting the sheet of Rabbi Meir. And yes, we have 2 versions in the Mishnah. We are going to read it the way we learned it in the Maskana yesterday in the Gemara. And the question will be, what happens if you have certain products that are usually sold in large quantity, which is the case by wheat? What happens if that will be sold in small quantity? And the same thing vice versa. If you have beans, which were in the times of Chazal usually sold in small quantity, what happens if someone sells them in a large quantity? The question is, will the halacha regarding who needs to tithe it, right, the seller or the buyer, follow the way this item is usually sold? And by the way, that would fit under the umbrella that we normally call loy plug, or the way we will understand, the way we will have the girs in our Mishnah, which will be Shitas Rabbi Meir, that we don't care about the usual manner, but we have to judge how this is actually being sold, its actual manner, and we'll follow the rule. Small quantity, seller. Large quantity, buyer. Now, finally, the Mishnah itself is going to give the definition. How do you define the midah gasa, the large quantity? How do you define what's the quantitative amount of the midah daka of the small quantity? What's going to be amazing is that we're going to learn about lach and yavesh. We're going to have a different way of measuring the lach, a different way of measuring the yavesh in the Mishnah. And then the Gemara is going to quote a brayso that also has these 2 different ways, as we'll see, but it's going to reverse whatever is used in the Mishnah for lach will be used for yavesh and the brayso, and the same thing, vice versa. Now, what we will have in Perek Sheni towards the end is a big chiddush, that there are times, according to one version, that even by tevel, which as we keep on mentioning, unlike generally Hilchas Kashrus, the responsibility is on the buyer. Tevel, the responsibility to tithe is on the seller. There are circumstances where both the buyer and the seller have to take off the maasros. We'll see how that's divided, and that's going to be connected to a certain Tanai Beis Din, as we'll see. And then we're going to conclude the Perek by learning about another such type of Tanai Beis Din, how it applies when meat is being sold vis-a-vis who's responsible to bear the cost and therefore the loss of the chelev, and who is responsible to bear the cost and the loss of git hanasha. And that will be more or less what we will learn up until the 3rd chapter. And on Daf Chav Gimel Amud Beis, the 3rd chapter begins by giving us exceptions where there are people that are allowed to eat the mai without tithing anything, and even more, a bigger chiddush, that one is allowed to give the mai to such people. Just as an example, that if you have a ani, a poor man who you are giving food, not only is the ani allowed to eat the mai by the letter of the law, even though the ani is a chaver and he's getting the mai from an amaretz, more than that, you, a chaver, are allowed to give untithed the mai to the ani. So there's an ani, there's going to be an achnasoi. We're going to see 2 versions what that means. We're going to have a machlekes beishamai and the other opinions in the Mishnah. And God willing, we'll dive into that. We'll see how far we can get in today's year. So we are starting today on Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph, again all the way by the Mishnah Halacha Hey, Rabbi Meir Omer. we're going to be following the Girsa as it's brought down in the Shinu Nuschais, which is also predicated on the conclusion we had on Daf Chav Beis in resolving, in making it clear exactly what a Shitas Rav Meir, and it will be that we follow the actual and not the usual. So says the Mishnah, Rabbi Meir Oimer, Es shedarkoi limadei bedaka, that if someone is selling an item that normally is measured out in small quantities, that's the meaning of limadei bedaka. So what are we talking about? Just as a mashal, beans. Beans in the times of Chazal, when you sold them and when you bought them, they were in small quantities. But that's the usual way it's sold. What happens when umedadoi bigasa? That's the girsa that we're reading. In other words, you sold it the way wheat is sold, large quantities. And yeah, we have the rule that when something is sold in large quantities, the obligation is on the buyer. And we're going to have, so the Mishnah says indeed, tfeila daka ligasa, that this item that's normally sold bidaka, becomes subordinate to the rule of the gasa. We care about the way it's sold. It's sold in large quantity, and therefore, anything that's sold in large quantity, that's the sugi we are already in a couple of days. It's the buyer and not the seller who's obligated to do the tithing. And I know that some don't even have it in the Mishnah, but again, we are following the nusach, the girsa of the Shino Nuschais, and the Mishnah writes it in both directions. In other words, to make it clear, however you will understand Chumrah and Kula, it's not that we go to Chumrah, it's not that we go to Kula. We follow this system, we go after the actual and not after the usual. In other words, the esh shedarkoi limadei begasa, something that's usually sold begasa, which will be wheat. But it was sold the way beans are being sold. Here again, consistent, same rule. Tfeila gasa ledaka. We look at it's being sold now as daka when something is being sold in small amounts. So the rule is that the seller is the one that's obligated and not the buyer. Gavaldik. So that already clarified, as we learned yesterday. V'zehu shitas Rabbi Meir. Now, finally, says the Mishnah, Ezemidagasa, how do you define a large measure? So when it comes to a dry food yavesh, the Mishnah gives the measure, a quantitative measure of the food itself. And what amount is that? 3 kav. 3 kav, just 1 kav is the volume of 24 eggs. 3 kav is therefore the volume of 72 eggs. So we're giving a very clear definition, sheer, of the food itself. However, ubalach, but when it comes to when selling liquids, and how do we define gasa daka, large, small? Here, amazingly, the Mishnah is not giving you a quantity of the liquid, but we are giving you the value for which the liquid is being purchased, and that is the dinar. In other words, for liquid, there's no measure in terms of value. And as we pointed out in the introduction, that why don't we have the same? The Pnei Moshe writes, because we didn't have it. We didn't know, but we remembered the value. There's going to be a brayso that we're going to quote in the Gemara, that does the opposite, mamish. In other words, by the lach, it's going to give you a volume measure of the liquid, and by the yavesh, it's going to give you not a volume, but a value measure. Okay, and finally, Mishnah is going to give you a case where even when the seller is selling a small amount, and when you sell a small amount, the chenvani has to be the one kederach selling tevel, doing all the tithing. Here we'll have an exception. Says the Mishnah, Rabbi Yosi, at least Shitas Rabbi Yosi, that when someone is selling either sali te'enim, a basket of figs, sali anovim, a basket of grapes, kupa shel yarek, boxes of vegetables. Here we say, Kozman shuhu moichran achsira. The word achsira means by estimate, meaning that he's not weighing it, nor measuring it, nor counting it. this actually follows beautifully with the way the Peirush HaMishnayos explained the sugya we learned yesterday, that the Mida Gasa and the Mida Daka, the rationale behind who has to tithe, it has to do with whether you're selling it precisely, and therefore you have to be the one, you the seller. Masha Enkain, if you add a heap, if you sell it, the harchava, so the buyer is receiving more than what he paid for. That is where we put it on the buyer. This mamash fits to the shita. Since these items, or when these items are being sold by estimate by achsaram, which means that the buyer is benefiting because he's getting a heaping basket, even though it's within the definition of above, it's the midah daka, it's considered a small quantity, but the buyer is getting more than he paid for. So over here, pater, meaning the seller is the one that's exempt, and therefore the buyer is the one that's chayiv to do it. Gavaldik, mamish gavaldik. So first, as the Gemara, going back to the, not to the first case of Rav Meir, but the Gemara is referring back to the second clause in the Mishnah of Ezuhi midah gasa, and what's the midah daka? So Zok the Gemara, that I want you to know that Al Dait the Hodein Tanya, that the based on the opinion of the author of our Mishnah, like we pointed out, when it came to the midah gasa, we spoke about 3 kaf. In other words, nasnu shir la yavesh, we had a volume amount when it comes to dry foods. V'lo nasnu shir la lach, we do have a value amount, but there wasn't a measure amount, like we already spoke out, the Pnei Moshe, 6 lines from the bottom, that this Tana Pasha did not know the midah of volume by lach. So what did they do? They didn't know it. Nasnu damim lalach. So they gave a value amount, and they didn't give a value amount to Yavesh. Why didn't they give a value amount? Because really, ideally, you were looking for a volume amount, a lot versus a little. However, Tani Rab Chia, the opposite. Rab Chia had a Mesoida. Hin, we know from the Beis Hamikdash, the largest liquid measure was a hin. A hin is 12 loy. The only time he actually needed the hin was by Moshe Rabbeinu in the Midbar, but because he used it, we always had the hin measure in the Beis Hamikdash. Happens to be, my friends, that a hin is equal to 3 kav, which is gavaldik. So hin midah gasa, hin. In other words, the same volume amount that our Mishnah gives from midah gasa, which is 3 kav, that transferred into liquid is the hin. The hin was midah gasa by liquids. Now let's ad b'chlal, ad v'lo ad b'chlal. The Bryce is very specific, meaning min hahin ulamata midah daka. If it's less than a hin, midah daka, the moment you have a hin or more, that's called a midah gasa. Now, when it comes to solids, this Braisa of Rab Chia did not know, did not remember, they forgot, they never received a Masoida of volume. So here they used value. And what value are we using for solids? A limon. Interesting. Limon is the name of a fruit, right? But limon is the name of a coin. And many say that it has the same value of a zuz. But let's just follow the words of Rab Chia. That limon is the midah daka, meaning, again, if it's milimain ulamayla, midah gasam. From limain, if it has the value of a limain or more than a limain value, that's called a midah gasa. But less, that's called a midah daka. In other words, says the Gemara. Now Gemara is saying, al daita the hodein tanya nasnu shir lalach v'loy nasnu shir la yavesh and nasnu damim la yavesh v'loy nasnu damim la. Okay, so that was important to get these qualifications. And moving on, my friends, to the Chav Gimel Amud Beis. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yechanan b'Shem Rab Shimon ben Yohid Tzadok. Now he made a statement. His statement, the case of the statement is not clear. The presumption is that we are learning the sugya of the Mai, but that has to be clarified in a moment. But his statement is that I want you to know that there is a Tanai Beis Din. Tanai Beis Din who there is a stipulation that was made by Beis Din that watch at the Trumas Meiser Mishal Moicher. Again, if we are presuming we're speaking about demai, that when demai is sold, who has to separate the trumas meiser? The seller. Actually, that's a lesser amount. That's only the 1%. Umaiser sheni has to come from the funds of the lekeach. Again, the havaminas that we're speaking about tonight. And when we quote this statement, b'shem Reb Shimon ben Tzadok, it makes absolutely no sense. But we are learning a few daf already about this. The baker, the chenveni, and the sitoin. No, frekti gemara. What are we talking about? Manon kayomin. Even mida dakom. If we're speaking about someone selling the small amount, and as we are quoting the words we had yesterday, hoyel v'hamoicher mistaked, so the moicher is mafresh, all, not only the trumas meiser, the meiser sheni. However you'll explain it, let's go with the Peirush HaMishnayos. You're selling it in an abundant way. Hoyel v'halikeach is the one that's mistaked because he's getting more than he paid for. So we learned in the Mishnah already, halikeach mafresh, all. What are you talking about? What's this Tanai based? And I know that we learned the unique din about a baker. We got that, but he's not talking about a baker. Like, Tanai based. So the Gemara gives two ways different of understanding this Rabbi Yechon b'shem Reb Shimon ben Tzadok. Answer number one, Amar Rabbi Bun bar Chia Tiftoid. You have to interpret and narrow down that we are speaking about amazing, not someone selling the mic. We are selling tevel. And I know that we keep on mentioning until now that when we sell tevel, all of the obligations is on the seller. And that's correct. Whether you're the farmer, the chulei, or whether you're the middleman, if you know what you have as tevel, you have to separate. But the case over here is, I'm selling from my own stock that I grew myself. When the seller makes such a statement, look inside the Pnei Moshe. Pnei Moshe, 9 lines from the top of the Amid. Tifta ba'omelai michnisai or michniyasai. That michniyasai means who oitzai shamachis bechanusai. So we're speaking about a person that his parnasa is that he grows it. He goes from the beginning until the end, and he sells it in a store. But he has in a store a storage house, a room where he has large amounts. That bisman sheroiv michnasim Yisrael ukaloimer sheoimaloi. The case of Rabbi Yechon b'shem Tzadok is that when the seller tells the buyer, "Kol machniyasi ani moichalach," I'm selling you in my entire stock. When I'm selling you my entire stock. So first of all, guys, what we have been learning until now is that once you sell a large amount, what does Rav Meir hold? You go after the actual. If you go after the actual, when a wholesaler sells, what should be the din? Normally the din is that he gets, that since the seller is selling the large amount, the buyer has to separate everything. And that's true when the wholesaler sells it like a wholesaler sells. Because he has over here a storage, a big room downtown. But when a person sells out of a store, that's the way the Pnei Moshe is saying. But he happens to have large amounts and he's getting rid of all of his merchandise. So even though based on the rules that we have been learning until now, since the actual is a large amount, all of the obligation should be on the buyer. In this case, there is a Tanai base and that it should be divided in half. Okay. Let's look inside the Mara folder, just trying to understand why would we make an exception. The top Mara folder. Okay, the Mara folder explains why will there be an exception. It's even though he sold large amounts, and he's selling over here tevel, the way I understand. This is not a person at all selling demai. And b'chlal, by tevel, the obligation is on the seller, by tevel. But we have been learning until now, this is important to point out, very good. We have been learning until now. I take back the whole question. We have been learning about the mai. Yeah, when you sell the mai, the mida gasa, the obligation is on the buyer. When you sell tevel, the obligation is be'ikaradin. When you sell tevel, no matter how much you sell, the obligation is on the seller. That's the chiddush over here. That even by tevel, when you sell this large amount, very good. The Tanai Beis Din has the expense divided between the seller and the buyer, the way he spoke out, that the moicher actually has to bear the lesser amount, and the buyer has to bear the meiser sheni. Really, you say bearing it, the lesser amount has to be given away. The meiser sheni, taka is on the lekeach, but the lekeach gets to keep it. Okay, gewaldig. So answer number one is, that's the way we're going to learn. Chiddush, that by tevel, by large amount, we at least divide it. It follows the flow of our sugya. Amar Rabbi Yosi, another answer, afilu teimar shaloi mehechne. So you don't have to limit the case of Rabbi Yerushalmi to tevel that's being sold in a wholesale manner. But let's go back to our topic. We're speaking about selling the might. Because according to Rabbi Yosi, when you sell tevel, the obligation is always going to be fully on the seller. Our kasha was, by the might, did we not already establish me the gasa me the daka? Answers, the Gemara clarifies Rabbi Yosi, here there's an exception. Because bo'omer midatoi nisaken. Midatoi nisaken, guys, the translation is, let us do it together. Notice, if he wouldn't have, if the seller would not have said, "Let us do it together," yeah, that's a whole different kind. Then we follow what Chazal told us. But when you say the word "us," when if both would have agreed and clarified that no matter what has to be separated as 50-50, then how would we explain to us half of the Trumas Meiser on the seller, half on the buyer, half of the Meiser Sheni on the seller, half on the buyer? That's the chiddush, that when a person says, we're going to divide the tithings upon us together, if they didn't further clarify what they meant, tonight based is that it's not 50-50% from Trumas Meiser, 50-50% from Meiser Sheni, beautiful. Narvos then, Kain Amruloi tonight based it means that all of the Trumas Meiser is the burden of the Meichen, and all of the Meiser Sheni is on the Lekeach, Gavaldik. So two very different ways of understanding the Chiddush of Rabbi Yochanan B'Shem, Rabbi Shimon ben Zajac. And now that we spoke about Tanai Beis Din, we're going to conclude the second chapter by saying the following, that Rabbi Lazar B'Shem Rabbi Hoshaya, there was another such Tanai Beis Din, prior to which there was one rule, and afterwards the Beis Din, for the benefit of the flow of the market, they made the following stipulation. Now we keep on mentioning that when it comes to kashrus, generally before any Tanai Beis Din, the obligation of kashrus is always on the buyer. Now let's speak about the way meat was sold, the way meat is sold. How is meat sold today? Go to your supermarket, you pay per pound. They weigh every piece of meat, and per pound you pay the price. Elamah, today when you buy meat in the market, it's fully kosher. It means there was shchita, and there was the melicha, and there was nikur. In those days, there wasn't nikur yet. All right, so when you went to the butcher, I don't even know if there was melicha. Melicha doesn't cause anyone to lose any part of the meat. It's just a time-consuming job. But when it comes to taking out the parts of the meat that may not be eaten, so we have two general categories, the chelev, right, and the git hanoshim. I have a simple question. Let's say that the meat is being sold by weight, and the person, the butcher, did not yet remove the chelev and the git hanoshim. How does it work? In other words, if I'm paying, I don't know how much meat costs. It's expensive. How much does kosher meat cost? How much do you pay per pound? Let's say you're paying $10 a pound. Someone can be listening and laughing. It could be I'm way off up or way off down. It's expensive.
That's what what kind of meat.
Okay, and you get a pound, but in the pound there's chelev. Yeah. So can you deduct? Can you say, oh, no. From the pound, I got X amount of grams of chelev. Who has to bear the expense of the chelev? either for the butcher to have to replace that amount in weight or for you to deduct the money. And the same thing with the Gid Hanasha. So at some point, Beis Din made a Tanai that HaChelev Mishal Tabach. The Chelev is on the butcher, which is the seller. Means if you charge the pound, you cannot add the Chelev. Chelev cannot be part of the pound. If there was Chelev in there, either the buyer removes it and tells him, listen, I want my money back, or give me the same amount in non-Chelev meat, in kosher meat. And the Gid HaNasha is Mishal Lekeach. Okay. And the Gemara says that in actuality, Hinig Rababo in the city of Kesarim that we learned about on this chapter, that Sheyu Shneya Mishalokeya, that at some point, and this is coming from a Yeridas Hadoides, as we'll speak out in a moment, he instituted something which goes beyond the Tanai Beis Din, meaning that all of the funds has to be out of the pocket of the buyer. Again, you have a medaken tavaus. In order for the butcher was the menaker. We want to make sure that when you do nikkur, you remove everything properly. Think about, it's sad, but it's real, it's practical. The Tanai Beis Din was that the chelev is on the cheshbon of the tabach. It means the more chelev the tabach removes, the more the butcher loses, because he can't charge for it. Removing the chelev until today is a big chachma. You know, many Ashkenazim, or Ashkenazim generally, we don't even go there. We don't even sell the back hind of the animal, because we don't have the proper mesoides of what's shuman and what's chelev. You got to know what you're doing. By the way, by Gid HaNasha, you also have to know what you're doing. If the butcher, right, is going to have to cut out the chelev and he can't charge for its weight, what's his objective? To cut out the minimum amount possible. So when people had more Yerushalmi, we were not concerned about that. But in Kesarim, maybe because of the fact there was chutz la'aretz, who knows what we learned in this chapter. At some point, Rabbi Bo decided, no, this Tanai Beis Din is not working. I would rather the buyer having to pay for all of it, so the butcher doesn't lose anything if he cuts out more, if he cuts out less. There is no clash of interests. That will allow the butcher to do his job better, which is to take out all of the chelev and not leave some in to get money from it. So this is a very good rule, a common sense rule, that if people are not on the highest level of being Yerei Shamayim, money is a conflict of interest. Don't create a system where there's a conflict of interest, which means if one party will do what they need to do, they're going to be losing more money. You're setting yourself up, God forbid, if there's a shayla, whether it's chelev or not, the butcher is going to be somehow motivated to sell it as shuman. And we don't want for that to happen. Beautiful. So the Tanai Beis Din stood, but not in the city of Kesarim. And on this we say, God willing, we'll come back to you the second chapter. And let's dive right into Perek Shlishi, Perek Ma'achil Esoanim, beginning with Halacha Aleph, all the way in the bottom of Gimel Amud Beis. Now we spoke out when we began this Masechta in Yerushalmi, that means on Daf Aleph, that normally when you have rabbinic decrees, even though their decree came because of a certain reason, right? They had a doubt about something, they had a worry about something. Once they made the takana, it's a hard and fast rule. What we spoke out, I think it was in the name of Yavda Asman Doiraisa, Rabbi Yosef Engel, is that the Mai is unique. In other words, the Mai is that even after the Chachamim made the Gezeda of the Mai, it's not like now this is called the Mai, and before you're removing the Trumas Meiser and the Meiser Sheni, you can't eat it. We don't look at it necessarily that way. It's more like the Chachamim are telling you, be suspect to the doubt, even though it's a minority doubt, but it's a substantial minority doubt, that certain tithings were not removed. In other words, it's not a clear-cut vaday isur derabanan. The Chachamim are saying you have to be chayish to the sfeika. It remains something that has a doubt inherently imbued in it, even though normally doubts are resolved by roiv and miyut. Here the Chachamim said, don't do that. Why am I saying that? Because we find exceptions by the mind. That's the opening shot of our Mishnah, that there are certain people that are allowed to eat the mai. That's chiddush number one. Chiddush number two is therefore you, a chaver, are allowed to give them the mai. That's another chiddush. Sometimes you can say one, even if there's a person who is mutter to have the mai, but another cannot give it to them. No. Who are the two people? The ani. Let's begin reading. Machilin esvaniyim demai means if you have an ani that you're feeding, whether he's coming to your home, whether you're giving him food on the street, you have in your house produce that you brought from the Amaretz that you bought. You know you're going to tithe it. You're chaver. If you're giving it to the ani, you don't have to tithe it. And by the way, the ani doesn't have to tithe it either. The ani can take it and eat it. The other one is the ach senoi. The ach senoi has two interpretations. One interpretation is guests, trying to find out where I read both, because in the Bible we had the sports troops of soldiers. One of the Noisei Kalim brings both opinions over here in the Mishnah proper. So either it means you have guests. You can argue that a guest is in the same category of an ani. Today you have your bank card with you, so you don't. Those days you traveled, you didn't have anything with you. You can be wealthy at home, but on the derech, what do you have? Nothing. So if you're hosting guests, let's go with the guests. So they are like aniyim, it's like in the same category. You can give them the mind. You can give them the mind. Now, guys, that's the whole point of the Asvan Doiraisa, that if we were to view that since the Chachamim, Yechanan Kan Gadol said, there's already too many people, still a minority, but too many people that are not fully tithing, we have to tithe. If it's a clear-cut rabbinic decree, we would not make exceptions. Here we have exceptions. Okay. Now, Rabbi and Gamliel went even more. And Hoyamachel es Payal of the Mai. Rabbi Gamliel, who would hire workers whom he was obligated to pay, that's already a step up. He would fulfill his obligation to pay. Another exception, because they are poor, with the Demai. Look inside the Marafulda. Now, this is only Rabban Gamliel, right? Mamash at the end of the Amid. The Tanakama Palig Olav. Why? Hoyel B'chaimim is going to say him. Since the agreement of them getting paid for their work is part, or all sometimes, was them getting food. Nimtzad comes out that if the Balabas would be allowed to give them Demai, Nimtzad who Pareach Chayvaisav, he's paying his debts with Demai. That's not something that we allow. I just want to point out that the first Maraful in the Mishnah already says that when the Mishnah gives the exceptions of Machil and Esvaniyim Demai and the Achnesoi Demai, there is a machlokes whether we are speaking about Aniyam Amei Ha'aretz or even Aniyam Chavedim. Okay. Aniyam Chavedim is the least problem. Maybe even Am Ha'aretz. And let's read inside the Pnei Moshe. He tells you right away one of the two sides. Machilin Aswaniyam ve'es achnesoi demai. He has a different girsa in the Mishnah. In our girsa it says demai twice. Aniyam demai, the achnesoi demai. He has one thing. You give the aniyam and achnesoi demai. Ha'orchim is this taich of the achnesoi. The way we said guests. Again, we'll see another understanding that it's troops of soldiers. Vafilu hein chavedim. On at least one thing, he has to notify them that he's giving them demai. Now look at the chiddush. Look at this then. You give it to a chaver, and the chaver doesn't necessarily have to tithe it. No, it's since the chaver is an ani, or he's a guest, if he wants, but he doesn't have to. Wow. Oh, here the Pnei Moshe writes. It's the mafashing that Achnesoi is Chel HaMelech. Which Melech, a Goyish government, that when they occupied the Holy Land, part of the rules is that when they're moving troops from place to place, who feeds the soldiers? That's a big back log. Back, you have to know how to do that. So the system is that the rule was it's part of taxes. Wherever soldiers went, every person has to host X amount of soldiers. So it is for them that the Mishnah gives the second exception that you can give them demai. And again, let's go with the Pnei Moshe that even though they are chavedim, they don't have to tithe it. If they want, they could. Okay. Now let's go back to in the Mishnah. Gabait tzedakah. Gabait tzedakah in our Mishnah means people, communal offers that would collect charity. and how it used to be then that every city had two tzedakah funds. One was a money tzedakah fund. One was a food tzedakah fund. The food was collected every day. It's common sense. People did not have the types of refrigerations or the way to preserve foods. And we all know that. You have leftover food, it's going to go to the garbage. So people would collect food every day from every home in the village, in the city, and they would distribute that food that day, every day to the aniyim. And then there would be another collection that was made once a week to give money to the aniyim that live locally once a week. Okay, so we're speaking, the Gabbai Tzedakah, the Gabayim, the administrators, were speaking about the collectors. What about them? So they're collecting food. They're collecting food from Amaratzim, and they're collecting it from Chavedim. Beis Shammai does not subscribe to the opening of our Mishnah. Let's call the first opinion the Tanna Kama. Beis Shammai argues with the Tanna Kama. Beis Shammai does not allow for aniyim to eat demai, and therefore Beis Shammai does not allow for you to give aniyim demai. So let's be practical. When you're collecting money, mela. By the way, if you know the money is really not kosher money, you got a problem. But you don't have to make such a big inquiry, right? But when you're collecting food from Aramaratzim. Most people were Amoritz. You're collecting food from the Chavedim. Beis Shammai holds that the food charity collectors needed to have like two boxes, two tamchois. Makes sense, right? One demai and one that we know you got from Chavedim. And what do you do with it? So look at the irony. The food that they received from Chavedim, who do you give that to? To the people that you don't trust will separate the demai separations. You use that to give it to the people, to the people, to the Amoritz. And the food that you get from the Amoritz, who do you give that to? You give it to the Chaver. Gavaldik. Why? Because you can tell the Chaver, here's the Chaim. The food came from an Amoritz. This food is the Mai. And again, Beis Shammai argues with the Tanna Kama. Tanna Kama holds, you just have to tell the Chaver. The Chaver doesn't even have to separate it if the Chaver is poor. No. Beis Shammai holds, what are you talking about? The Mai is a Mai. It's a rabbinic law that you have to separate Tumas Meiser and Meiser Sheni. And by doing that, Nimtzu Kumtois, that Kol Adam and everyone is going to eat food that's properly tied. Now the Chachamim in our Mishnah, they agree with the Tanna Kama. You are allowed to feed the Mai to Aniyim, and therefore don't put such a burden on the food collectors to having two containers, having two boxes, and to know what came from what, and you flip it. You give the chavers to the Amoritz. You give the Amoritz to the chavers. No, goyvin stam or machalkin stam. Now, like what you learned in the Pnei Moshe, v'hareitzel l'saken yisaken yovaldik. So basically, we have in our Mishnah the way we learned the Mishnah, the shita of the Tanna Kama and the Chachamim, that there are exceptions, and the shita of Beis Shammai, they completely disregard these exceptions. In consequence, this will affect how you collect the tamchoy, and then you also have the machlokes in the ratio between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel takes the heter all the way to the extreme that you can pay your obligation of feeding your workers when they are poor from the Mai, God willing, to be continued.